According to the original Trilling Seminars Committee, which was circa 1975, I quote, "We look for scholars whose breadth and originality of mind can help the public understand what studies in the humanities can contribute to a clarification of the issues and value assumptions that underlie contemporary life. The committee seeks to identify scholars who are known both for original contributions to their own disciplines and for having addressed questions of major contemporary importance to both scholars and the educated public." End quote. Amanda Anderson is surely the sort of scholar that the original Trilling Seminars Committee had in mind. She's the director of the Kogut Institute for the Humanities and the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of English and Humanities at Brown University. Her research, as we'll hear tonight, focuses on 19th and 20th century literature and culture, addressing broad questions of intellectual history, disciplinary formation, and the relations among literature, moral life, and politics. Her most recent book, Character, 3 Inquiries in Literary Studies, with Rita Felsky and Toril Moy. Toril Moy actually gave a Trilling seminar lecture in 2014. The book was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2019. Her other books include Psyche and Ethos, Moral Life After Psychology, Oxford University Press in 2018, Bleak Liberalism, University of Chicago Press 2016, The Way We Argue Now, A Study in the Cultures of Theory, Princeton University Press 2006, The Powers of Distance, Cosmopolitanism and the Cultivation of Detachment, Princeton 2001, and Tainted Souls and Painted Faces, The Rhetoric of Fallenness in Victorian Culture, Cornell University Press 1993. She's also the editor of George Eliot, A Companion, 2013, and Disciplinarity at the Fin de Siècle, Princeton 2002. In 2020, she launched the podcast Meeting Street, Conversations in the Humanities, and from 2008 to 14, she served as the director of the School of Criticism and Theory, which is, most of us know, an interdisciplinary summer institute hosted by Cornell University. She serves on the boards of the School of Criticism and Theory as an honorary senior fellow, and the International Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes. Prior to joining Brown, the Brown faculty, she was Caroline Donovan Professor of English Literature at Johns Hopkins University. I'm also going to introduce her two respondents, both of whom are eminent scholars in their own right. I'll introduce them at briefer length. Nick Dames is the Theodore Kahan Press. Is it Kahan or? You don't know either. He's the Theodore Kahan Professor of Humanities in the Department of English at Columbia University. He's the author of Amnesiac Selves, Nostalgia, Forgetting in British Fiction, 1810 to 1870, Oxford 2001, which was awarded the Sonia Rudikoff Prize by the Northeast Victorian Studies Association, and also of the physiology of the novel, Reading, Neuroscience, and the Form of Victorian Fiction, which was published in 2007 by Oxford. He writes on contemporary fiction and other topics for The Atlantic and Plus One, The Nation, New Left Review, The New Yorker, The New York Times Book Review, and Public Books, where he is currently the co-editor-in-chief. He's the recipient of many awards for his teaching and scholarship, including a Charles Reiskamp Fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies and the Mark Van Doren Award for Teaching, which is given by undergraduates at Columbia University. And our second respondent, I'm not sure, are we going in this order? Pick whatever order you want. I'm going alphabetically. Nancy Youssef is professor of English at Rutgers University, specializing in literature and philosophy of the Romantic era. Her research and teaching are centered in British and European Romanticism, but also extend to 18th century sources and forward into the later 19th century. She's especially interested in the intersections between philosophical writing and literary form, and in the relations among aesthetics, ethics, and the representation of emotions. She's the author of 3 books: Isolated Cases, Cornell, 2004, Romantic Intimacy, Stanford 2013, which was the winner of the Baricelli Prize, and The Aesthetic Commonplace in Oxford in 2022, just out, yeah. And as well as on essays on Rousseau, Wollstonecraft, Wordsworth, Mary Shelley, and Dickens. and they've appeared in a number of scholarly journals. She's also been the recipient of fellowships from the Newcomb Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. So I'm going to turn it over to Amanda, but please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thanks so much, Eileen, and thanks to everybody for being here. Sound okay? Can you hear me? Okay. I also just want to thank in advance, because I might not want to thank them after, I'm just kidding, Nick Dames and Nancy Youssef for agreeing to be the respondents. I greatly esteem both of them, and I think their work is just really extraordinary, so thank you so much for agreeing to serve as respondents. Okay, so this should run about 35 to 40 minutes, okay? And I'm just going to say a couple of things about it first. It's drawn from an essay written for a special issue of Genre in which a wide range of scholars take up John Guillory's cultural capital, its insights, its influence, and its limitations, now that we are 30 years out from its publication. I think it's especially pertinent to the context of the Trilling seminar, since, like Trilling, Guillory sits at a remove from some of the more influential forms of critical discourse, and he also, like Trilling, comments upon them in powerful ways. Both also tend toward a somewhat tragic or bleak view of the world, and both caution against forms of ideological and moral aggrandizement, but in different ways. I'm not going to be talking directly about Trilling tonight, but I wanted to signal the resonance of the context, and I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. What I most want to be doing is to press on some key features of Guillory's text that I think help to light up some more general tendencies in the field that hold us back from developing a more productive approach to political psychology, which strikes me as a particularly urgent topic at present. I've talked a little bit about this elsewhere, though not with respect to Guillory, particularly in a 2017 piece called Therapeutic Criticism, and also in Psyche and Ethos. Lastly, this paper tries to do justice to the complexities of Guillory's text, so it moves back and forth between the arc of the argument around psychology and other sets of observations about Guillory's text. So it's not linear all the time. It concludes with a discussion of the ways in which field conditions have changed since the writing of Cultural Capital. Guillory's influential 1993 book, Cultural Capital, The Problem of Literary Canon Formation, promotes a sociology of the literary field framed by the concept of cultural capital as elaborated in the work of French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. At the same time, it advances a critique of the misprisions of a field that has failed thus far to acknowledge and use that important concept. The exposition moves back and forth between these tasks, between critique of the field's current practices and revising the history of criticism in terms consonant with Bourdieu's sociology. I mention this fundamental pattern because it will shed light on the ways in which Guillory's book remains so relevant at the present time. This relevance is proven not because the field has failed to heed the message of cultural capital, though that is part of the story, but because the overall form of Guillory's account is itself symptomatic of the field's enduring analytic tendencies with respect to an intellectual domain that stands apart from both literary studies and sociology. That domain is psychology. The core critique of the book is that in its approach to the canon wars, the progressive literary field manifests an aggrandized and fundamentally mistaken sense of political relevance and potency. It does so by assuming that creating a greater breadth of representation in the canon with respect to gender and race immediately translates into political representation of and for those groups. What lies behind this error is a failure fundamentally to recognize the importance of class. Cultural capital, a class-marked set of privileges and forms of access that exceed mere economic power, is for Guillory the key factor driving the developmental and historical transformations attending the production and study of literature, which for Guillory is above all an activity that takes place within the institution of the school. In the realm of literature and literary scholarship, cultural capital manifests above all as a manner of using language in speech and writing. It's a form of literacy and a command of literary competence that generates access, mobility, power, and belonging. This social fact is what the literary left should be focusing on, rather than an enlargement of the canon based on racial and gendered selections, inattentive to the subtending force of class and literacy within specific historical contexts. As Guillory puts it, quote, "A politically effective critique of literary education would be better served now by discarding the problematic of representation for a problematic whose object is the systematic constitution and distribution of cultural capital." He goes on, "For if social groups now imagine they are too different to speak the same language or to be represented by the same cultural works in the schools, they are nevertheless always exchanging the same currency, even in the symbolic form of cultural capital." He ultimately advocates for, quote, "the project of replacing the current critique of the canon with something like a sociology of writing and reading." In many respects, Guillory's critique is advanced through a form of argument that is apodictic in nature. The language of error and mistake repeatedly occurs. And interestingly, at a key moment early in the text, Guillory in fact makes a point of saying he's interested fundamentally in errors of assumption and argument, underscoring that he is not attacking the political commitments of those he critiques. As he writes in the first chapter, quote, "It will not be necessary to dissent from the larger aims of the progressive social agenda, far from it, in order to raise a question at the level of theoretical assumptions about the relation between the literary curriculum and representation." And yet the double negation of this statement hints at complexities that are being bracketed for the moment, because it soon and repeatedly becomes clear that accompanying Guillory's insistence on faulty theoretical assumptions is another level of argument that is social psychological in nature. When Guillory starts to probe the motivation for the error, he attributes it to anxieties about the waning prestige and power of the literary field, both within the educational system and in the social world. Thus, we are given a psychological reason why the literary field projects an inflated sense of its mission. It does so in order to counter a half-lit awareness of its ultimate powerlessness. This powerlessness does not come out of nowhere. A broad historical account of the field's diminishing influence appears in the book's initial presentation of its thesis. Quote, "To put this thesis in its briefest form, the category of literature names the cultural capital of the old bourgeoisie, a form of capital increasingly marginal to the social function of the present educational system. From this perspective, the issue of canonicity will seem less important than the historical crisis of literature, since it is this crisis, the long-term decline in the cultural capital of literature, which gives rise to the canon debate." Regardless of one's assessment of the set of claims in this announced thesis, it's important to note that the psychological assumptions at play throughout the book extend beyond any time-bound lament over lost influence or diminished relevance. This is because embedded in these sociologically inflected psychological assumptions are general views regarding human motivation and social psychological dispositions. In particular, a guiding sense of the centrality of struggles for esteem and standing in any social field. This orienting frame is acutely evident in Guillory's later analysis of the Sokol affair, which addresses battles for standing among the disciplines and divisions of the university. I will return to Guillory's discussion of the Sokol affair a bit later in the talk. In its emphasis on the core activity of trying to secure and maintain forms of distinction, Guillory's account of the field is of course consonant with the Bourdieusian framework. But notably, Guillory's scenarios take on a dramatized and markedly psychoanalytic life of their own across the interpretive analyses of cultural capital, as he enters into close and extended readings of texts and individual figures. In the first chapter, treating the rise of vernacular literature in the 18th century in the context of ambivalent responses to new forms of social mobility, Guillory engages in a discussion of various forms of repression, resentment, and displacement manifested in Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. Later, the reading of de Man's institutional role with respect to the rise and significance of literary theory rests heavily on the concepts of transference, displacement, and mastery, with special attention paid to de Man's followers' profound psychic investments in the deluded idea of charisma as inherently anti-institutional. Similarly, the chapter on the new critics, and especially the near allegorical analysis of T.S. Eliot, refers repeatedly to structures of fantasy, wish fulfillment, inhibition, and defensiveness. As Guillory writes, the most profound assumption of Eliot's fantasy was always that literary culture is the site at which the most socially important beliefs and attitudes are produced, the site at which those beliefs and attitudes are generated, which unify the culture. When we state the basis of Eliot's social criticism in these terms, is it not obvious that this remains the wish fulfillment fantasy of literary culture, that it is still what we would like to believe about that culture? This dimension of Guillory's text is important because it sheds light not only on the analytic frameworks animating Guillory's account, but also on certain conditions at play then and now within the more theoretically minded sectors of the literary field and the humanities more broadly. First, the psychological narratives provide a kind of human interest that deepens or thickens what might be seen as an airless sociological method. One might call it a kind of crypto-humanism routed through the psychoanalytic register of the hermeneutics of suspicion. Second, they provide a window on Guillory's view of human and social motivation and interaction. Ultimately, Guillory's view is somewhat bleak and somewhat cynical. Actors don't tend to have a lot of self-knowledge, and they tend to act out their social position and status anxiety in symptomatic ways, which the literary critic can help to flesh out, and the historical sociologist can ultimately place and judge. Indeed, while the suggestion is that one must exit the literary field and enter the sociological one in order to gain any true knowledge of the former, there remains a repeated return to the narrative richness of psychoanalytically inflected individual readings. These narratives variously emerge and recede over the course of the book, as Guillory presents a series of case studies meant primarily to reveal the role that linguistic and cultural capital play in the evolving literary field. It's worth focusing especially on the discussion of the new critics and of theory itself, particularly when aiming to place the horizon in which cultural capital was written in conversation with the contemporary horizon of the field, and in particular the question of the place of psychoanalysis then and now. The story told about the new critics is routed through T.S. Eliot's desire for literature to play the role of an orienting order, or, quote, a historical substitute for doxa, in an era when there is no longer a unifying orthodoxy available. In this scenario, literature functions as the refuge of a distinctive unorthodoxy, either in the form of heterodoxy or paradox, one or the other. The first, heterodoxy, is represented by the work of F.R. Leavis, who upholds those works which, quote, embody a kind of heterodox or critical relation to modernity. The second, paradox, by the work of Brooks and the new critics, where, quote, the social inhibition that disallows literary culture from making doctrinal claims of the orthodox sort drives these claims back into the refuge of literary form, which is to say, it drives them into the refuge of paradox, which is then valorized as a way of apprehending elusive complexities. In tracing how the centering of paradox as the defining feature of literary language became installed in the school, Guillory focuses on two competing cultural forces that were at the time establishing dominance or encroachment in relation to literature: science on the one hand and mass culture on the other. As Guillory tells it, the experience of paradox originally had to do with a heightened experience of the loss of unity under the conditions of modernity. Hence, it indexed a relation to literary form that was historically informed, critically focused, and existentially dense. Yet as paradox became refined into a subtending quality of literary language itself, it lost these features. It became mere formalism, one might say, but more was involved. In elevating the truth of literature to an unnameable or elusive status, the new criticism wards off what Guillory refers to as, quote, the epistemological bully whose name is science. And in valorizing difficulty, it also protects its domain against the incursions of mass culture. Here again, we see how important to Guillory are the rivalries among cultural and disciplinary elements, how stark the battle for status and preeminence is. Over time, both of these rivals will overshadow the literary sphere, and the field will be caught up in a series of attempts to reassert preeminence, which for Guillory will remain fundamentally misguided. Central to the argument of the account is the rise of theory, which Guillory views as an attempt to reassert a realm of mastery and to advertise the sophisticated study of literary language as the most demanding and rewarding site of humanist study. At the same time, the turn to theory is in part prompted by new sociological conditions, insofar as theory models itself on the techno-bureaucratic labor of the new professional managerial class. This mirroring is evident in the highly technical nature of theory, its reproducibility via disciples, and its infinite capacity for greater degrees of specialization. For Guillory, however, the more practical and effective university site of the techno-bureaucratic labor of the new professional managerial class is not theory, but composition, which at the same time as theories rise is gaining a larger share of the enrollment numbers of undergraduates who instinctively know that this is the kind of reading and writing through which they stand to gain the most in the surrounding economy. This fact, the centrality of composition as the new site of class-based linguistic literacy, will be the basis for Guillory's recommendation that composition should be the site of advocacy and activism within the discipline, rather than social identity via the opening of the literary syllabus or the sophistications of literary theory. The mistaken sense of political relevance that inhabits the Canon wars also appears in the account of theory's rise and claim to significance. The fundamental error reappears. The fantasy that a particular method or epistemology guarantees or effects without mediation a radical politics. Larger political forces of the time, such as the Vietnam War, this is his account, are imagined as the impetus, but what takes place in this stage of the field's ongoing struggle for relevance is a methodological mistake, transposing a claim about the contingency of language, the fact that linguistic signs are arbitrary, onto the social field. This error then allows for an inflated sense that merely to demonstrate linguistic contingency produces political effects, dislodges sentimented values, practices, or ideologies. Alongside this claim, an investment in the charisma of the theorist and the association of that charisma with certain anti-institutional energies further fuels the false sense of political impact or meaningfulness. The article on the Sokol affair takes up and amplifies the argument made about theory's aggrandized notion of its political force. Widely reported across academic and even mainstream journalistic venues, this scandal erupted when the physicist Alan Sokol successfully published a hoax science studies paper in the left academic journal Social Text. The scandal involved the insertion of what appeared to many as undeniably ludicrous statements about the social construction of physical reality. In assessing why the editors of the journal were so susceptible to the submission, Guillory reprises his argument about the faulty move from contingency to politics in the literary field, governed as it is by the default assumption that, quote, an anti-realist epistemology, alternatively expressed as anti-foundationalism or relativism, is a requisite for any progressive politics, and conversely, that realism, foundationalism, or universalism underlie, at the level of the episteme, as it were, all that is regressive in our society. It is the dedication to this assumption more than anything else that led to susceptibility to the hoax. Taking a wider perspective, however, Guillory also argues that the entire event was a symptom of a much more consequential conflict of the faculties, in which social science was displacing the humanities, and in which the humanities was failing to promote itself as the site of the production of knowledge, instead holding itself up as the critique of knowledge. In so doing, literary and cultural studies allowed themselves to be relegated to, quote, a belief system or theology in relation to the scientific disciplines, close quote. Unless and until literary studies claims for interpretation the status of knowledge, Guillory argues, it, and the humanities in general, will continue to, quote, stand in opposition to science as the occasion for renewed conflict of the faculties, close quote. Guillory's attention to rivalry among fields and the fight for prestige amplifies the drama of various actors and of the field generally, as I have noted. Yet while subconscious drivers remain at play in these narratives, there's otherwise a stringency of method in Guillory's general sociological and ideological approach that refuses or excises the experiential and lived dimensions so vividly in play in many literary and cultural theorists, whose frameworks often combine, sometimes in inventive ways, a systems critique with a lived perspective. The psychological dimensions of the account, that is, remain within an ideological framework oriented toward struggles for power and failures of self-knowledge based on a psychic aim to shore up esteem or compensate for what is essentially a narcissistic wound on the part of the field and its actors. What's missing then is a sense of more consciously held value commitments and reflectively engaged lived experience. Meaningful knowledge can only come at the level of the sociological perspective or through field assertions of knowledge content. On the one hand, this approach is symptomatic of the powerful influence of psychoanalysis on the field's understanding of human motivation and action. Yet on the other hand, it fails to capture the less skeptical and more affirming ways in which field developments have approached the drama of lived experience. To take one striking example, one might consider the role of paradox in the contemporary literary field. Guillory emphasizes the movement within new criticism from paradox as a way of giving expression to an experience of loss under modernity toward paradox as a model of elusive truth whose energies are internal, linguistic, and formal. And that sense of paradox as a linguistic and formal refuge also seems to reemerge within theory in a somewhat different guise. But such a notion of paradox does not capture its current function in the field. If we consider more recent paradox-infused theoretical concepts, such as cruel optimism, slow violence, or critical fabulation, for example, we see instead a nuanced attention to the interplay between self-reflexive aspiration on the one hand and acknowledgement of entrenched structures of power on the other. Thus, cruel optimism specifies a situation in which the conditions of late capitalism tempt subjects to believe they can attain some version of the good life, one which that system ultimately cruelly denies them. In such a scenario, it is certainly the case that to some degree the subject is caught within the system. But Berlant honors the lived aspirations of her subjects and also identifies and acknowledges forms of life that creatively respond to these conditions or remake them within limited scales of practice. Similarly, in Rob Nixon's analysis of the slow violence of environmental degradation, attentiveness to the experience of environmental injustice is joined with a longer perspective that captures the geopolitical and socioeconomic forces behind the unequal effects of environmental pollution and climate change. The emphasis on slowness itself is evocative of experiential and historical time in a way that a systems approach would fail to capture. And Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation involves an attempt to imagine forms of lived experience under racialized systems of power when the historical archive itself is incomplete or filled with haunting blanks. All of these concepts and the methods of approach that accompany them seek a way to combine value-laden critique with forms of interpretive understanding that honor lived experience, creative aspiration, and ways of seeing that are not simply the result of structuring ideologies or psychological delusion. In pointing out the more recent itineraries of paradox in the field, I'm not asserting that they are exemplary of a correct way to approach the field's simultaneous investments in sociocultural analysis and lived experience. In some ways, they're symptomatic of unresolved theoretical and methodological tensions themselves. For example, Berlant's analysis is hampered by an arrested dialectic between cruel attachments to ideologically laden objects of desire and impulses toward newer aesthetic forms and practices. And Saidiya Hartman's method might be seen as moving more in the direction of literature than history, thereby raising a host of questions, even as it vivifies imagined lived experience. But what's worth noting is that viewed in contrast to these examples, Guillory's approach seems all on the side of ideological blindness. Guillory maintains a sociological stance with respect to his major claims, which is to say he maintains an objectivizing perspective, arguing that forms of belief and commitment within the field are irrelevant to the more determining systemic drivers, the struggle for distinction and prestige among the fields, the need to assert a claim to significance given diminished actual power. Thus, both existential perspectives as well as avowed normative commitments tend to be either myopic or compensatory, either ideologically symptomatic or psychologically reactive. Beyond this, something further appears to be implied at several junctures. Simply to stress the normative significance of the field in value-laden terms is to fall into the discredited sphere of religion, belief, and theology, as was evident in that quote I gave you from the Sokol paper. And here we need to really step back and take stock of what a powerful effect the sociological framework has on Guillory's presentation. As I've argued elsewhere, justifications of the humanities tend to move between two poles, the pole of method and the pole of value, or ethos. Justifications that appeal to method focus on the practices and skills that the humanities employ and teach, emphasizing critical thinking, interpretive argument, communication, and writing. Justifications that appeal to ethos, or value, emphasize the assumed value-imparting or inculcating effects of humanistic study, highlighting concepts such as empathy, civic awareness, and reflective self-actualization, or Bildung. I share what I take to be Guillory's concern that overstressing the role of the humanities as somehow directly imparting certain values can make it seem as though the humanities functions as a catechism, that it has relinquished critique for dogma. This is problematic. At the same time, emphasizing method also carries with it certain limitations and problems, for as Guillory himself will admit, no field has a monopoly on the stance of critique. Now, in some ways, Guillory is not really engaged in cultural capital and justifying the field. Rather, he's attempting to diagnose its failures of self-understanding and its misguided political aims relative to the more consequential socioeconomic conditions of access to cultural and linguistic capital. This is an important task and still a necessary one. But it's not possible or even desirable to attempt to minimize the normative and existential dimensions of work in the literary field or the humanities more broadly. The humanities are ineluctably involved, not so much in the direct transmission of values, but rather in the clarification of questions of value. And in doing so, they are always combining method and ethos. This ineluctable normative dimension is part of the human drama of the humanities. In Guillory's account, as we have seen, this human drama is restricted to forms of acting out, always within the context of aiming to gain or preserve standing, whether as an individual or a collective, in particular a discipline. In this sense, psychoanalysis, which can of course be an illuminating contributory method, plays an outsized role in Guillory's account, as it has throughout the era of literary theory and its aftermath. This privileging of psychoanalysis effectively keeps other ways of understanding human motivation and human relations at bay, and it dovetails in a non-conflictual way with the diagnosis of ideological blindness. In standing in for the human, it effectively displaces experiential dimensions that are more closely tied to moral aspiration or value commitments. Thus, Guillory can easily say he agrees entirely with progressive aspirations or intentions, while also saying that at another level, these aspirations or intentions are misguided because blind to the forces that produce them. Yet this sidesteps the question of what sort of political effect the actual work of Canon critique did produce, as well as the ways in which it may have changed hearts and minds. Just consider for a moment the work of the creative classes, who were schooled in this ostensibly misguided way, and their larger cultural influence through television, film, and journalism. This dimension of the cultural landscape lights up potent cultural changes wrought by the forces of pluralization and inclusion in the literary field by actors ranging across the liberal radical spectrum. To point to the importance of reflectively affirmed value commitments is not to say that we should abandon psychology altogether. It's rather to expose the constraints of certain psychological frameworks that have asserted dominance over the field. The Freudian approach, with its emphasis on fundamental drives, human aggression, and unconscious motivations, was itself challenged by post-war paradigms in which environmental factors were emphasized over innate drives, and in which forms of interaction and recognition could form the basis of healthy attachments linked to social and political values associated with democratic rather than authoritarian forms. The key psychoanalytic theorist here was D.W. Winnicott, whose concept of good enough parenting and the holding environment helped shift the therapeutic model along with its social and political implications. In the realm of critical theory, Jürgen Habermas and Axel Honneth similarly shifted the focus from a world dominated fully by instrumental reason to one in which communication, interaction, and meaningful recognition could serve as the basis for emancipatory interests. What these approaches allow for, without denying systemic forces or forms of human aggression and domination, is the social and experiential bases of those normative aspirations oriented toward dignity, respect, recognition, and repair. One need not abandon psychological sophistication when acknowledging the reflectively held value commitments of the actors within the literary field or the humanities more broadly. One note in this context, it's arguably the case that the many appeals to post-critique in the field in recent years is a reaction to the kind of constraint that Guillory's model of analysis imposes in moving behind the backs of the agents it describes, but post-critique moves too far away from the question of how we might better conceive a relation between systemic critique and individual and group psychology. So now I'm going to shift and come into the close pretty soon to a kind of just general set of observations about some things that are different now from when Guillory wrote the book. There are many aspects of Guillory's argument that were powerful at the time of their publication and remain powerful today. First among them is the insistence on class, access, literacy, and the historically changing forms of linguistic and cultural capital within the field itself. This was and remains a huge achievement, an ongoingly important challenge to the field. It is, in fact, Guillory's own strongly held normative commitment, and it is an admirable one. In the early 90s, as today, class tends to be a neglected category of analysis, not easily assimilated to the forms of academic advocacy associated with other forms of identity. Guillory is also right in his observation that the emphasis on representation in the Canon Wars is interconnected with media influence on, quote, virtually all aspects of our lives. He said that in 1993. Getting scary. At the same time, however, the rise of new media has generated many disparate effects, which makes Guillory's attempt to match representativeness in the canon to representativeness in the media somewhat narrowly construed. The world of the school that Guillory wants to shield from the effects of mass cultural forms has, since the writing of his book, expanded outward to various media channels in ways that are increasing the forms of access that Guillory's sociological framework wants to highlight. There's much that is negative about social media, and yet still, at the present time, the amount of intellectual transmission that goes on via social media, YouTube, and websites, including full-length lectures, symposia, conferences, and podcasts, is vying with in-real-life events, including the graduate seminar, and altering the terms by which intellectual content is delivered and charisma is understood and experienced. Arguably, there is a waning of the aura of the in-person event, which profoundly affects the conditions within and beyond the school as Guillory conceives it. There are also opportunities that come with this shifting terrain, including access to forms of cultural capital and the languages, practices, and habits associated with them. This is not to argue that YouTube can provide what the university provides, either practically or symbolically. But the forms of intellectual community and transmission associated with new media do require acknowledgement and ongoing analysis. It's also worthy of note that the fast-moving academic sector of the media landscape is fueled in part by the altered conditions of the academic market, which it at once registers, reflects, documents informally, and responds to. This is especially true in the case of academic Twitter. The character of the field's anti-institutional investments, which remain relevant, have also changed over time. Anti-institutionality signals the field's failure to recognize the importance of the institution of the school as Guillory defines it. It also is coterminous with the field's commitment to and comfort with forms of negative critique. This anti-institutional element of the field has taken on heightened form, particularly in the last decade. A number of targets appear among the growing calls to decolonize, but it must be noted that not only the syllabus, but the humanities and the university itself are prime among them in a way that could not be anticipated in Guillory's book. His analysis does not use the word neoliberalism, which has come into dramatically more widespread use since the book was published, nor does it discuss the corporatization of the university or the academic left's increasingly potent skepticism towards the school in which it works. It seems possible that Guillory would say that the forms of anti-institutionality that take the university for a target remain as bluntly conceived, politically diluted, and sociologically benighted as those forms identified in his 1993 analysis. This surmise raises the question of where Guillory himself falls ideologically. Interestingly, despite the strong emphasis on class analysis, which might seem to imply a more radical than liberal stance, the implication of his critique is that the radicalism of the literary left fails to address challenges or devise strategies that would extend access and literacy, particularly within the institution of the school. This is fundamentally a liberal, reformist stance based on social democratic principles, which is somewhat ironic given Guillory's tendency to denominate the Canon expansion project as itself fundamentally liberal. As a final note, it's worth considering whether Guillory's framework illuminates or distorts more recent developments in the research universities, both with respect to his account of the political aspirations of the humanities and with respect to his view of the conflict of the faculties. While it's certainly the case that the field's political focus on the syllabus has only gotten more intense, it remains arguable whether this is merely a heightened form of the disavowed marginality or sense of waning influence Guillory saw motivating earlier canon critique. Much of the context is pretty profoundly altered. First of all, the condition of graduate student workers, many of whom are formally unionized, as well as the diminished prospects for entering the academic field, are playing a powerful role in defining how syllabus critique and even the field's method debates are playing out. Second, the newer forms of asserting relevance for the humanities, especially around engaged scholarship, public humanities, and co-creation of research with surrounding communities, are arguably not vulnerable to the charge of diluted political agency that Guillory leveled against the literary field 30 years ago. Beyond this, the very move within many research-intensive universities to create an ecosystem of centers and institutes dedicated to transdisciplinary and collaborative research, which to a degree displaces the prominence of isolated departments and fields, is a newer phenomenon that cannot be easily reduced to a conflict of the faculties, wherein the humanities is once again doomed to misrecognize itself and scramble for a level of prestige it is structurally and culturally fated never to attain. I think the humanities are being gaslighted, but that's another talk. I'm giving in Stockholm in a week. Okay, with shots of Ingrid Bergman. Certainly there are ways in which the humanities can be viewed as less resourced, less valued, and less visible in ecosystems which elevate impact research areas such as brain science and data science, and which overfocus on grant dollars. But the humanities centers and institutes create the conditions for a consolidation and assertion of the primacy of the humanities perspective to the project of the grand challenges. In areas such as the environmental humanities, which first grew out of literature departments in the field of eco-criticism, or ethical AI, or within the currently urgent and burgeoning democracy projects that bring together scholars across the human sciences, the utter centrality of the humanities becomes clear in its attention to human experience, the lessons of history, the clarification of value, and the importance of communication across media. In such a context, any analysis of cultural capital, which cannot also recognize the profound importance and efficacy of the field's self-consciously held normative aspirations, will be showing us only a very partial reality. Thank you.
Because it so acutely sets out the power of his project and the limits to that power, but also because I think of the sheer timeliness of the topic. And this isn't just a matter of anniversaries, even if the book's 30-year anniversary, astonishing as that just now sounds to me to say, is the immediate occasion for Amanda's intervention. It's because this is an excellent moment. Given the imperiled state it seems that the humanities cannot help but feel themselves to be in, to consider whether the analyses in cultural capital still might be of use, or to put another way, whether what I'll call the stance of cultural capital, its disposition, might or might not be of some help to us now. So what I mean by this, and in saying it, I don't think I'm saying anything very surprising. Cultural capital had a peculiar and almost unique fate. I'd say it was one of the most widely read and admired books of its decade in literary studies, almost immediately declared a landmark work, and yet had almost zero practical effect. It changed nothing that it set out to change. In fact, the conditions it set out to describe have not only remained in place, but intensified. I really don't know of a disjunction so vast between the acclaim for its cogency and a collective refusal or inability to take on board the purpose of that cogency. I don't know anything like it in the field. Cultural capital is routinely, and I think entirely justifiably, held up as an example of bracing acuity. Its case studies do, I think, remain stuck with you after reading it, like a burr you just can't remove. Its skepticism about the usual sites of professional intervention is very hard to shake, like a nightmare lingering into waking hours. Or perhaps cultural capital was the thing waking us up from pleasant dreams of social and political efficacy. But the comparison with Trilling that Amanda offered at the start here is useful, I think, and there's a useful difference, too. In my understanding, I think Trilling's famous diffidence kind of preemptively negated, as a kind of protective defensiveness, any possible ambition his ideas might have been taken to have. But not so, I think, with Guillory. Cultural capital reads to me now as if, let's say, it had hopes. Whatever one thinks of those hopes, they've been decisively dashed. Right? The culture war that Guillory hoped to redirect and the specific modalities in which it's been carried on that Guillory thought misguided are still with us, with only a very slightly altered vocabulary. In this sense, the 1990s never ended. Or not quite. So what should startle us now, despite how accustomed to it we might be, is how much of the context of the culture war has deteriorated since the 1990s, meaning that the site of the struggle, the university that houses the culture wars, has undergone fairly severe decomposition in those 30 years. And what Guillory called in 1993 capital flight in the domain of culture, and as the status decline of literature in the age of electronic media, has become something more like a status collapse. So call it then stasis within a crumbling structure. We're doing the same things while everything around those things gets a little bit worse all the time. Now, whether we would have been better off heeding the call of cultural capital is, of course, one question we might ask ourselves. But the question I take it that Amanda asked tonight is somewhat different. It's something like, why wasn't that call heeded? Or what in that call inhibited its potential for practical effect? What is it about Guillory's rhetorical position, or what we might call his stance, that actually forged his book's strange fate? Well, my own way of understanding that stance is as follows. Guillory's really our profession's great disenchanter. Cultural capital is, I think, a monumental effort at disenchantment. Perhaps those who read it were accordingly disenchanted by it, with the habits of their discipline, with the tactics it employed, and the beliefs the profession seemed to require, or perhaps not, because there are resistances to disenchantment. Grappling with disenchantment seems to be the best way to understand cultural capital's strange fate. Now, Amanda doesn't use the term disenchantment. Perhaps that's because she doesn't trace Guillory back to Weber and may not think that's a useful genealogy, but I think the terms she has used tonight are related, and they're remarkably helpful in analyzing Guillory's stance. I also think that she's given us two strands, which might take us in two different directions. So the first, I will call, as Amanda did, psychology. So in Amanda's talk, Guillory's apodictic procedure relies upon psychologized narratives primarily for local color, to thicken or enliven the real motors of his argument, which are sociological. And the specific psychology employed, centering on struggles for status and the affective fallouts from those struggles, such as resentment or the formation of compensatory illusions of power, is too narrow in its scope to take account of what she calls consciously held value commitments and reflectively engaged lived experience. Now, as an account of why cultural capital's recommendations failed to have any effect on the profession it addressed, this is, I think, not only a brilliant observation about Guillory's procedure, but a remarkably sympathetic account of the barriers to its reception. So it would be easy, and probably too easy, I think, to reach for a kind of accusation of professional hypocrisy. That is, that a profession so frequently interested in disenchantment had no great relish for being itself disenchanted. But instead, what Amanda opens out here is as follows: how difficult it can be to absorb sociological insight given the distance between the school's social function, as Guillory describes it, and the beliefs necessary to go on operating in a day-to-day manner within it. It isn't so much a question that is of refusing to believe that the work of literary scholarship is to produce and disseminate forms of cultural capital, primarily to the professional managerial class and those who seek to enter it. Put another way, it isn't simply a question of disavowal, to use a word from within what Amanda shows us as Guillory's psychoanalytic register. It's closer to a question of scale. One might very well acknowledge that the primary function of the school is exactly this kind of funneling of cultural capital, while feeling that the transactions within the smaller spaces where day-to-day work happens act in a more orthogonal or even just chaotic manner than this primary function. And there, one can bring to bear various lived commitments in order to find a space to reflect, ironically or agonistically, on the social function one serves despite oneself. So Guillory's sociological arguments are clear, even stark, at one scale, but become very slippery in smaller scales because of the disjunction between the totalizing way he invites us to see the function of the school and the commitments lived within it, which can't be written off as forms of psychic compensation or acting out, or an unthinking residual voluntarism. So psychology, then, I take it, and Amanda's unpacking of the specific shapes of psychology underpinning Guillory's argument helps explain a kind of debility inherent to that argument, one that made it impossible to absorb the insights of cultural capital in anything like an effective manner. So for instance, if you were to believe that the shape of the Canon debate, I'm going to use here Amanda's very concise summary of that, quote, manifests an aggrandized and fundamentally mistaken sense of political relevance and potency by assuming that creating a greater breadth of representation in the canon with respect to gender and race immediately translates into political representation of and for those groups. If you were to take that on board, what follows? What practices does one abandon? At what scale of action does such abandonment occur? Furthermore, and I think with particular relevance now, how do you abandon a debate when in fact one's enemy wholly agrees about the importance of that debate? If we were asked to concede that admitting into the canon instances from underrepresented social groups is politically inert, because, I guess the way I would put it is canon's gonna canon regardless, doing their usual work of social distinction, it turns out that the right-wing enemies of canon revision don't actually concur. It seems useful to keep in mind the peculiar way in which the discipline's supposedly compensatory overvaluation of its political significance is now mashed by the far right, which seems to confirm all of our overestimations. Just in the past few years, we've gone from ineffectual howls of protest at the inclusion of Toni Morrison on college reading lists to the active banning of Morrison's books in secondary school libraries. So when the enemy agrees about the importance of the terrain you're battling over, it's hard to be convinced to shift your emphasis elsewhere. And that may be reactive, but how are you not supposed to react? From the standpoint of the professional literary scholar, after all, a syllabus and who's on it is one of the few things, at least, under your direct control. But I want to take up the other term Amanda employed here right at the start of her talk to characterize Guillory's stance, and that's this term tragic. It came at the very start of her talk, and for me at least, lingered with considerable force, particularly when I thought of what I've called cultural capital's strange singular fate, because after all, strange singular fates are the very stuff of tragedy, to be singled out for the most spectacular and impressive forms of failure, or to be heard when one predicts the future and not to be believed. to have special insight into both the necessity and vanity of action. And this may even relate, I think, to the category of the mistake or the error, Amanda, that you mentioned, because, of course, tragedy is fascinated with mistakes, errors, great errors of character, as Aristotle said. If I'm convinced by Amanda's description of Guillory's psychological stance as a limitation of his insight, I find myself much more attracted to a picture of cultural capital as tragic, of Guillory's stance as bleakly conscious of the tragic dimensions of human aspiration, particularly in two ways: its blindness and its futility. So blindness, the notion, as Amanda paraphrased it, actors don't tend to have a lot of self-knowledge. Futility, not simply the long-term pointlessness of action, but something closer to the logic of the pharmacon, which I really think is always there in Guillory, where the cure is the disease or accentuates the disease, right? Where our attempts to solve a problem cause it, in fact, to erupt elsewhere with redoubled force. So, for instance, a Guillory-esque proposition I'll offer, that literary scholars have no choice but to attempt to legitimate ourselves in the public sphere, but legitimation is, in fact, a mug's game, doomed to create exactly the kinds of blurry overestimations that confirm in our publics an idea of our ineradicable and unwarranted elitism, the very elitism legitimation was an attempt to circumvent. Now, I'll admit, I'm personally compelled by a tragic relation to action, and if it makes cultural capital rather bleaker than I had imagined, more aware in advance of its own magnificently intelligent futility, it makes the book seem ever more of a landmark, ever more exceptional, particularly given the default anti-tragic progressivism of the field it was so avidly read by. Finally, what I wonder is how Amanda feels herself about this tragic element to Guillory. As herself our preeminent theorist of bleak forms of liberalism, Amanda's slightly, dare I say it, optimistic, possibly even self-congratulatory account of literary profession's advances were offered in response to Guillory's tragic sense. But does Guillory kind of cast a shadow over that account still? So just as a way of finishing my response, I want to play Guillory for a second, or try on the tragic sense of cultural capital, and see what it might say about at least a couple of the positive developments which ended Amanda's talk. So first, the new public humanities, the forms of engaged scholarship Amanda described as not actually so vulnerable to the charge of overcompensatory delusions about political agency, as Guillory believed of late 20th century theory. Now, I suspect that a Guillory-like reading of this development might suggest that this is in fact a different kind of compensation, a preemptive abandonment of professional autonomy, just as that autonomy seems to no longer have any rewards to offer any longer. A move that is from a functioning profession to a parasitic relation to other professions, like journalism, professions that themselves can scarcely take on any extra burdens as it is. Or second, the growing ecosystem of centers and institutes dedicated to transdisciplinary and collaborative research. It's displacing isolated departments and disciplines. A consolidation and assertion of the primacy of the humanities perspective, that's what Amanda calls it, a kind of restructuring capable, potentially, of confronting some of the grand challenges of the century. So here too, what if, this is an ironic thing to say at an event under the aegis of the Heyman Center, what if the decentering of the department is another pharmacon, a desire for autonomy that ends up sacrificing our only real grounds for autonomy, the self-regulating form of the department, interlocked as it is with disciplinary structures that exist outside the direct control of the university, and instead finds refuge in initiatives whose mandates might easily be erased by the fickleness of administrative fiat, become vulnerable to the vicissitudes of fungible budgets. It might even be said, and again, I'm just sort of summoning the spirit of Guillory's tragic sense here, that the humanities concept is itself already such a doomed retrenchment, a last defensive stand, sacrificing genuine methodological differences among temporary allies in a futile attempt to resist the inexorable prestige of the sciences and the terminal decline of the cultural capital of humanistic fields. So, deep breath. I should add here, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I believe this. I don't know if I want to. I don't know to what extent Amanda is convinced by this bleakness or what she would make of its utility, what feels like its counsel of despair. I don't know if there are better examples of humanistic advance than these, less susceptible to skeptical corrosion. Well, perhaps I do think there might be one. I think it is important, and Amanda gestured to it, and it's worth potentially exploring, that Guillory's book comes out in 1993, immediately after the initial wave of, I think that what now looks to me a kind of epical moment, the initial wave of strikes among graduate students at private universities in 91 and 92, particularly at Yale, where Guillory once taught, that I find harder to exercise my tragic sense about. I do know, however, that the tragic view, the sense of the inevitable ironies of our actions, has less place than it might in our disciplinary self-conception, which for me makes Guillory continually worth reading. But how much of it can we bear? This is what I think Amanda is well equipped to help us think through.
So we're going to have so much to talk about in the Q&A. All right, everybody can hear me? Or lower this thing. How's that? Okay. So thanks to the Society of Fellows for the invitation to participate on this occasion. And thanks to Amanda for inadvertently reviving memories of charismatic theorists and canon wars. At least I think thanks is the right word. I was in graduate school here at Columbia, as a matter of fact, when students protesting the core curriculum covered the names of the male authors inscribed on the facade of Butler Library with a banner bearing the names of important and neglected women writers. John Guillory's Cultural Capital appeared precisely at that moment. On its cover was a New York Times photograph documenting the protest at Butler, an image in which it's hard to, everybody knows this cover, I think, an image in which it's hard to tell if the banner is in the process of being put up or pulled down. And as it turns out, that ambiguity is presciently appropriate. In trying to shore up my memory of that event with the help of Google, I learned that a new version of the banner was temporarily installed in 2019 as part of a series of events honoring what the organizers, including the head of the university libraries and faculty at the Institute of Research on Women and Gender, described as, quote, critical inquiry into the cultural heritage that is at the heart of liberal education at Columbia. An undergraduate opinion piece about the 2019 installation argued that in so describing it, the university had effectively, quote, stripped the original banner of its status as a critique of the institution itself, thereby enabling the university to escape responsibility for its role in the exclusion of women and other marginalized groups from the curriculum. The facade of the library remains unmodified, a potent symbol of the institution's resistance to substantive change in the author's view. So, shall we say that critical interventions occur twice? First as acts of protest and second as acts of co-optation? Or shall we say rather that the forms of cultural and political critique that John Guillory targeted 30 years ago, and that on Amanda's account Guillory himself represents, inevitably place us in a catch-22, where participation in the university, however oppositional a stance one takes within it, is liable to the charge of bad faith. Maybe this is a version of Nick's tragedy. As was noted in passing in Amanda's talk, growing calls to decolonize extend from the syllabus to the humanities as a whole and the institution that shelters them. So I want to devote my response time to saying something about how Amanda's work offers a way out of this impasse for those of us who might want one. In particular, I want to flesh out her idea of engagement with lived experience as constitutive of work in the humanities, lived experience as belonging to our objects of study and as proper to our methods as scholars. As I understand it, lived experience entails the inclusion and acknowledgement of the significance of a first-person perspective in our work, not as an end in itself, but as a necessary constituent in reflective judgments that inform moral aspirations, entail normative values, and shape the ways we conceptualize and converse about these aspirations and values. I'm aware that every part of that last sentence is a point of contention. The existential fact, let alone the value of a first-person perspective, the possibility, let alone the cogency of normativity itself, the validity of terms like morality and value in the context of the demystifying sociocultural analyses that have been the norm in literary studies for the past several decades. So how does Amanda's work establish a context for the meaningful use of these terms? What makes the appeal to lived experience more than the expression of a longing for something outside our contingent, historically situated practices? It's important, I think, first to appreciate the conceptual force of an approach which is both unsparingly critical and dialogically measured. Amanda's handling of Guillory's work in tonight's lecture exemplifies the reasoned and respectful form of debate and argument she advocates. Her disagreements with Guillory are sharp, but do not preclude a conscientious account of the book's value as an incisive history of the field of literary studies. The intellectual generosity is honest, an honest expression of commitment to pluralism, and not merely a matter of courtesy. I think, in other words, that the generosity is methodologically important as a civil framework for her powerful criticism of the limitations of sociocultural analyses, according to which the individual turns out to be always embedded within systems that wholly determine the horizon of her possibilities and of which she is largely unconscious. Amanda aims then to make lived experience visible as an absence in Guillory's work, easily overlooked because symptomatic of presuppositions he in fact shares with the targets of his own critique. Now, in much of her recent work, and most expansively in Psyche and Ethos, Amanda has shown how prevailing approaches to politically oriented literary studies have absorbed and assimilated an early psychoanalytic view of the self as composed of unconscious drives and largely in the dark about its own motivations and aims. Significant features of psychic life, first-person experiences of interest, desire, grief, joy, hope, despair, and so on, are typically exposed as or reduced to superstructural illusions covering over the intractably real systems that govern and organize the social sphere in all its striations from family to nation-state. And as in any successful therapy, the diagnostic procedure is crucial for progress. Amanda aims to open up an intellectual and theoretical space closed off by the under-acknowledged psychological presuppositions operative in systems critique. Into that space, alternative approaches to psychological experience can be accommodated, approaches that allow for the meaningfulness and even for the ethical and, dare I say, political efficacy of lived experience. But the possibility of considering such alternatives, indeed the need for alternatives, can really only emerge when underlying assumptions are surfaced. So the work of identifying the under-acknowledged and crudely Freudian picture of the psyche implicit in systems critique is itself an important contribution to recent debates on method in literary studies. For Amanda, the most generative alternative is to be found within the history of psychoanalysis itself, in the object relations account of individual development that profoundly reshaped the theory and clinical practice of the field in the post-war decades in England and the United States. There's an interesting sub-story here, I think, that, we could talk about as within the literary field of why, the whole Anglo-American post-war psychoanalytic tradition has been sort of, ignored and not absorbed into work that is otherwise pretty interested in psychoanalysis. But that's to the side. For Amanda, the work of D.W. Winnicott in particular is an important theoretical resource for a relational model of the psyche and also for the imagination of a maturational process that involves a complex interplay between emotional experience, memory, and moral capacity. It's the need for an integrated understanding of psychological phenomena, moral aspirations, and ongoing entanglements in the social sphere that the term lived experience is meant to capture. But that's only half of the story. I've focused in these remarks on how Amanda tries to open a space for a richer account of the psyche in our field, and that endeavor is only one part of an ambitious effort to bring normative and reflective judgment to the fore in literary critical theory and practice. The commitment to normativity and to what Amanda elsewhere calls clarification of values is related to a recognition that moral questions take shape, change, and come to varied articulation within individual lived experience. And there's an important disciplinary implication here. Insofar as Amanda understands lived experience to be a necessary constituent of reflective judgment, then neither a sociological nor a naturalistic or scientific framework will elucidate the sense of normativity that she's after. Hers is a normativity achieved through the inclusion rather than the exclusion of subjectivity, and for that reason it is, I think, necessarily subject matter for the humanities. I understand Amanda's emphasis on normative commitment and on value in the broadest sense as providing a generative synthesis of defenses of literary studies that have tended to focus either on method, on the particular skills involved in our scholarship, or on cultural content, the traditions or counter-traditions that we impart in our curricula. But the stakes of the commitment extend, I think, beyond literary studies to the humanities more broadly. Where might we seek interlocutors and collaborators for a revitalized account of normative commitment and for a willingness to grapple with the essential role of lived experience in reflective judgment? Amanda mentions Habermas and Honneth as important sources for thinking about communicative rationality and the political challenges of recognition. For psychologically rich accounts of the complexity of moral life, one might also turn to figures on the outer margins of Anglo-American philosophy, whose work is profoundly engaged with literature as well. To Stanley Cavell, for example, and the entailments of acknowledgement, or to Iris Murdoch and the moral ramifications of attention. Both of these thinkers make appearances in Amanda's recent writing on character. I would also make a plea here for engagement and collaboration with philosophers who are not outliers. Figures such as Christine Korsgaard, Thomas Scanlon, Thomas Nagel, Bernard Williams, whose works rethink normativity and who are at least somewhat humanistic in their orientation. They're not alone in wanting to explore issues of intention, belief, agency, and freedom in ways that the scientific naturalism so dominant in philosophy cannot accommodate. And if we had more time to talk about it, I'd suggest that some of the constraints that Amanda identifies in the sort of hold, the grip of sociological analysis on the literary field, there's a similar kind of grip in talking about lived experience in philosophy departments that are under the spell of the epistemological bully of science. Right. In any case, there ought to be room in the humanities centers that Amanda describes at the end of her talk for philosophers and literary scholars to rediscover what they have to learn from one another about the complexities of ethical experience. Among the many urgencies of our political and cultural moment, there is a need to think ever more explicitly and rigorously about common bases of agreement, about judgments that do and do not depend on the consensus of a community, and about how to defend norms of evaluation in the face of brute exercises of power and manipulations of fact. Vigorous disagreement ought to be the catalyst for refining a shared set of norms, but even that becomes impossible if we cannot get clear on the role of normative consensus in determining what kinds of claims and forms of justification make our arguments and our agreements meaningful, and also of how lived experience enters into those determinations.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Jeff and I went to graduate school together. We wrote our dissertations in a little library at Cornell. Okay. One thing I would say is that, you did that little hint at the end of cultural capital too, the thought experiment. I think it's a one sentence thought experiment that, gestures towards the aesthetic as a possible site of freedom, and then that notion gets played out in his article, Bourdieu's Refusal. So you have that element. I mean, it's interesting. On the train today, I was thinking about Trilling, and I was looking back at bleak liberalism and the discussion of Trilling, and what kind of came to me was that, because I have a chapter on Trilling and Adorno, was that Guillory is a little more like Adorno, in the sense that you're only going to get the kind of the gesture toward a possible informing ideal or sight of freedom is utterly negatively indicated. And that's so. But to get to your question, I mean, I don't feel like, I think you're right, but I don't particularly want to try to redeem or find a place in Guillory that's going to do what I just don't think he's doing. Right. Nick might have something more to say about that. I'll save. Yeah.
Jeff, in the context of your remarks, I was thinking about something that struck me about Cultural Capital the first time I read it, and then the most recent time, which was very recently. His primary agon, in a lot of ways, institutionally, is with composition and with composition studies, about which there's a really fierce ambivalence in relation to the role of the relationship between composition and the literature department. The thing that he doesn't take up, which I find even more fascinating, is the role of creative writing in relation to the literature department. And it's an interesting blindness. I don't know what it would be. There might be very many reasons for it, but given that he's interested in these practices of writing and the school as the site of the certain, inculcating a certain idea of literacy, that form, which, as we all know, has been, I hesitate to say, like, we literary scholars still owe a lot to the creative writing course in a kind of spillover way, and maybe even more than what he seems to be saying in Cultural Capital, which is which strikes me as I don't know, not particularly realistic thing to say. Students seek out composition courses because they know that this is the form of literacy that will do them, stand them in the best stead in the labor market. I'm not sure that's true. I think there's much more of an attraction to play than he's willing to admit. But it's just an interesting silence to me there, and I've never known quite what to make of it. Your comment suggests a little bit of what might be the reason.
I mean, I would also say to play and to first-person experience, because even in nonfiction writing now, which is a huge major at Brown, that's really the focus of the kind of writing that's being done and what is ostensibly composition. So that, and that, I think speaks to Nancy's points.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I really love this. I was wondering about intentionality, which came up I think a couple times, and it's a little bit old-fashioned to ask this question, but it kind of came up obliquely. What is literature? The object of study. This one topic that didn't come up too much, but was alluded to. And intentionality being regarded as the object of literary study with new criticism. I mean, I think was really important. But we're talking about people like Cavell, and I'm talking about normativity, talking about, I think one, like a Kyoto Programmer who's here, intentionality is normativity. So it seems to me that maybe the three of you are kind of the new intentionalists. And would you reject that characterization? Maybe not so much Professor Dames, but if we're going to study literature and make it more about first-person point of view and intentionality, then isn't that in a way revising that kind of foundational commitment to anti-intentionalism?
Well, I think I'd want to hear a little bit more about what you mean by intentionality, but I'll say something about what I think about when I talk about the inclusion of a first-person perspective. And what it's not is a kind of return to a sort of indulgent, focus on subjectivity and kind of the phenomenology of the self, and certain tendencies in post-critique, I think can be that, right? Can be just sort of quasi-confessional responsiveness to literature. I think the importance of the first-person perspective has to do with getting to that, approaching a kind of, when is there a kind of authority or there's a sense of legitimacy in moving from the I to the we, right? And is that even a legitimate move? And I think that's something that does get worked out on the page often in some of the literature that we read, some of the philosophy that we read, and it's this dynamic sort of relationship between the subjective point of view and a kind of normative view, right? The normative is, it's not like out there oppressing me, right? It's sort of also an internal structure, right, that has to do with, with my acculturation, with my indoctrination into a culture and a society. Again, not in a bad way. It's just how we are raised, how we come to speak language, how we come to be members of a community. But it's a two-way. There's a two-way sort of traffic as well, where my individuality can sort of extend out and enter into like the broader conversation and the broader dialogue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I would not say I am a new intentionalist. A couple of things I would want to say here. First of all, that what I am most interested in, I'm very interested in lived experience, but what I'm most interested in is, I'll say a coherent dialectic that involves lived experience and a systems view. So the reason that I like, the Habermas and Honneth is that I feel that they locate the basis for the systemic critique in primary practices. In Habermas's case, having to do with communicative action, and in Honneth's with respect to recognition, and aspirations to dignity and respect and recognition. That those are the and this is part of his critique of Habermas, whatever. But that there's a kind of you can see the basis for the norms that animate the systems critique in the affirmation and commitment to certain primary human practices that aren't guaranteed to be successful or undamaged by forms of power, but that are nonetheless, aspirational and locatable and linked to certain kinds of healthy forms of interaction and development. So that's really important to me. And the other thing I would say is that while I do tend to read with the grain to some degree, which is to say not read suspiciously, that doesn't in any way preclude or prevent aspects of interpretive argument about certain texts that attribute blindness, as I have obviously done tonight. So that's what I would say. But so I don't think it's quite a kind of return to intention. Though I really appreciate the question, because it really presses on something that I think is really important to the conversation. I mean, could I say one more thing, just because we didn't get a chance to talk to each other yet? So that's good. That's usually the first thing they have you do, and everyone's like, I'm going to ask a question. So, but I did want to just say, because it actually is completely connected to my answer to your good question, is that I think that so I love the idea of Guillory as Cassandra. This made my day. But I think so bleak liberalism, the bleakness in here is in the systems view, but the liberalism is this sort of, the aspirational element in the face of the bleakness. And so I think that's a kind of an important distinction. Though I just loved everything you said and found it incredibly thought-provoking, and I know I'll keep thinking about it, but I just wanted to make that one, I would make that one distinction there. Yeah.
And I end up, one of the things I really valued about the work you did there was being attentive to and really trying to excavate it, because I think it has to be excavated what his normative commitments are, right? Which I think often got badly misread in the initial wave of reviews of that book. There was a version of the negative review that I think unsympathetically understood it as just I can't think of a better word other than just kind of crypto-conservative, right? And the better critiques of that book were ones that understood that at some level, his political commitments were quite otherwise, but the route to their expression was so strangely blocked, right? So, but the aspiration is there, and I don't think you read the book successfully if you don't see that.
Yeah, I mean, with the tone, I think was a huge.
Yes.
The Mandarin tone was really.
Yes.
It was really weird to read that book. Yeah.
It's steely. I mean, it's the word I keep calling it. It's which he's so good at, but it's so hard to place. It was very hard to place in 1993 politically, and it's even harder to place politically now.
So, so I guess I have a question which I guess is a little bit historical. I think that by the time Guillory's book comes out, there are a number of books in the early 90s that call attention to a kind of crisis in the university. And I think even Bill Readings reviews the Guillory book or makes reference to it by the time the University of Ruins comes out shortly thereafter. And that critique, of course, is that the university no longer has a national or cultural mission that's identifiable. And as a result, there's a kind of many people and disciplines and everything perhaps lost in the absence of this. What's replaced it is this kind of generic embrace of excellence as a kind of placeholder. So I guess my question is, to what extent, the continuing scramble to define literary studies or figure it out is, I mean, it's a separate issue, but the ability of the sciences to navigate better in the absence of a cultural or national mission is an interesting story. I get that it's fun to bash science, but I also think that's an interesting story, how it was used. But as far as literary studies go, I wonder to what extent this conversation tonight is a continuing discussion of what to do in the absence of a university that Trilling could rely on. And I just wonder what you think of that.
You want to start, or?
I mean, I'll take a crack at it, which is I think that there are exogenous and factors to this, which maybe Amanda would want to address. I do think Guillory has places a lot of burden on something like internal factors. It's a little hard to know how internal they are. And this might go back to your question earlier. My sense of his analysis is that the missing element has been missing for a long time, but it took until I think in Guillory's history of this, it would not be until something like the 1980s where the missing element really makes itself felt, which is that we may have a method or a series of methods. We may have an ethos, but we, for whatever reason, don't have an object we're able to agree on. And the sciences do. They seem to be better organized in terms of their being willing to define the object that they study. And I think this is what Guillory is saying, have been oddly resistant to this, or have attempted to wish it away, or jettisoned it so long ago that we don't even notice its absence anymore, right? I mean, this is, I think, a lot of what's behind his critique of the high theory moment, was the attempt to salvage this by deciding that our object was literary language, right? Almost language per se. And that's I think an internal reason that Guillory would claim for the reason of our kind of debility in relation to the sciences. If you don't have an object, it becomes very hard to claim that you're producing knowledge. And when you can't claim that, it's much harder to compete. I think, but I'm more struck with what feels like the exogenous side of your question. What about the university that Trilling could still rely on isn't in place anymore, and when did it stop being in place? It seems hugely important, and not not, the question of fault is so important in cultural capital. Whose fault is it? Is it a fault internal to the discipline itself? Or, is it that the infrastructure we built is kind of flimsy, or is it that there's a meteor heading for the infrastructure and there's nothing we can do about that?
I think it's hard to answer that question via comparison to science. Are the humanities loss of literary studies loss of a kind of mission or sense of common mission, or even the humanities loss of a sense of common mission? I think, Amanda's interest in sort of the normative at least is an interest in, okay, is there a structure of agreement that we can sort of abide by about what would count as a relevant set of questions, or a relevant approach to a set of questions, relative objects. But without the possibility of that discussion, then we actually can't agree, can we, as a culture or a nation, on what the common mission is in the fields that we study. In other words, I'm not sure that it's our fault as literary scholars or as academics, right? That there's a outside the university sort of breakdown of cultural consensus about what ought to matter. And so just anecdotally and very quickly, at Rutgers, where I teach, and there's no core curriculum. I think the persistence of core curriculums, I'd have to look into this a little bit more, but I feel like that's something that is still like it persists in elite institutions more than in public institutions, because public institutions have to serve a variety of interests. And anyway, so there's no core curriculum per se, although there's some sort of distribution requirements. And we found in the English department that a lot of our students just didn't know some basic things, like when the Civil War had happened, and what was in the Constitution, like some stuff that you just might want to have in place for a very elemental conversation in an introductory literature class. And so we approached the history department. We're like, hey, how about, we do an introduction to literary studies. How about teaming up with us on a few sections, and you guys can do like basic American stuff, and really civics, and we'll do some related American things. They were completely uninterested in that, and said that it would that the mere suggestion of doing so would sort of provoke a kind of war in their department. And it's not because they're at war with one another. It's just, I think that's symptomatic of of the broader culture. That's not a happy answer.
Yeah, so the question you're asking is quite huge. So I'm just going to answer like part of it, or I'm going to talk about one element of something I see going on, and it also is a partial response to Nick's ventriloquizing of Guillory's response to my more, we'll say optimistic, some of my optimistic gestures at the end of the talk. Interestingly, one of the things that Nick was talking about was that Guillory, when talking about, when sort of responding to the notion of, say, public humanities or co-created research, or even, the forms of integrative scholarship on let's just call them societal challenges, would see that as indicative of even more, waning influence, and an attempt to basically have a parasitic relation to other ventures, right, that were not actually the field-defining ones. And I guess, one thing that I would say is that it seems to me, and this is a little bit, this is a kind of, this question of the department and how important it is to kind of protect the department. One thing I think is really not helpful in framings of, the loss of power of humanities disciplines, is over-focus on majors, actually think it's not the way to think about it, and it's allowing all of these dispiriting drumbeats and sort of like these, every 3 months you get an article in one of the major newspapers presenting this data, but it's very misleading. And I'm at an R1 university that has an open curriculum, it's unusual, no distribution requirements. And it's fairly, how can I put this, innovative and creative in terms of its approach to integrative scholarship. And, but I think a lot of R1 universities are doing this right now. And one thing that I've noticed, having kind of been, outside a department for a while, is that, because I run a humanities institute, is that I would say 10 years ago, there was a way in which a lot of people in the humanities were saying, we're really important, pay attention to us, you need us if you want to talk about AI. I think it's flipped. I think, I just was sent a proposal to establish a data science institute at Brown. And the first thing I did was word search, humanities, 12. That's amazing. And I mean, that's just I don't mean to like turn it into a word search, but then I read it. And it's something has altered. And it's not that, it's that these integrative approaches are themselves, actively seeing the need to engage and integrate the humanities and the arts. Now, I think that's super interesting. Where does it leave delimited disciplines? I'm not sure. There's, I'm just like not into zero sum, and I'm not into, that'll hollow out this or that. But I do think we need to think very differently about how we imagine because these things are all undergoing transformation. Nothing is like standing still, and there are aspects to traditional departments that need to be rethought. And I think, that's all I have to say.
Can I ask you a question about that, which is, do you imagine PhD programs that could become like integrative in that way? So like where we're not training, PhDs in a discipline. Yeah.
I mean, that's right. So no, right. I mean, I think it's hugely, I think the kind of, the protection of bodies of knowledge and, methods of research is really important. I mean, at Brown we have a collaborative humanities doctoral certificate. Mm-hmm. So people getting a PhD in a humanities discipline can get what's essentially a half master's along the way, which, does these, involves these really cool collaborative things. But you still have as the basis the PhD in the discipline. So, right, I mean, the reproduction of expertise within disciplines is hugely important. But I do think being too rigid about what counts as that is a problem. Mm.
So we're out of time, actually. But I wanted to end on a slightly more optimistic note. Lessons, and now we're there. If you join me in thanking